Well, there you are, and here I am. And out in other places, church is a three-dimensional place anymore, isn't it? And that's a good thing. And that's a very good thing. I'm Pastor Randy Munt. I'm doing, as was said earlier, a little bit of time over at Abiding Hope to make sure they stay out of trouble. I don't know. It's a full-time job. But I'm glad to be with you today. I'm going to send out a bio next week, so you just have a little bit of idea of my almost 40 years of ministry. You can look at me and know that that's not hard to believe, but it's true. Just suffice to say today is I've lived in 5 other countries. And so some of what I say reflects the experiences that my wife and I have lived abroad, as well as serving some 10 or 12 churches here in Colorado, mainly as interim pastors. They usually chase me out, after a year or two, sometimes shorter time than that as well. I went to school in a Lutheran seminary in Canada because I thought, why not? Why not go to another country and experience what this world has to offer? You only understand yourself, right, when you get outside and look back in sometimes. And so I went to Canada at that time, back in the late 70s. Yeah, that was a terrible time for carpet and everything else, wasn't it? It was all, some ugly colors out there. Matter of fact, music wasn't very good in the 70s either. It was a lot better in the 60s, as I recall. But that's just my bias of growing up. There was a show in Canada that reflected very much like 60 Minutes did in the United States. And it was called W5. I can't remember if it was CBC or CTV that had it on, but it was 5 W's. Who, what, when, where, why, right? The ones that we have. Those are the questions that we ask. They all start with a W. Kind of like when I talk to my son that lives in Wyoming, I say, why does Wyoming start with a W and when start with a W? Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. So the story today that we just heard read is an interesting story. Who? This is a great way to do a Bible study, by the way. This is a great way to look at verses in the Bible, whatever we have, and ask those 5 questions. Because if we ask those 5 questions, we're going to learn something about what the author, the gospel writer, in this sense, John, what does he want us to learn from he's writing down? Because he's writing this down with a purpose, is he not? In fact, when we get to the end of John, what does it say? These are not all the stories about Jesus, but these are told so that you may have faith and believe in him and have life in his name. Those are the words that John says. And so who? In our story today, who is always an answer. When you bring the children forward, always the right answer in the church is what? Jesus. Jesus. You got to say that with a little bit of an attitude. Jesus, So Jesus is the answer here. Who? Jesus is where? He is in the temple area, and he's dialoguing. We don't have in this passage, but in earlier John, the 10th chapter, it tells us that he's with the Pharisees. What does the word Pharisee mean? We're an intimate group here. What does the word Pharisee mean? The ones that are separated. They saw themselves as separated out of society in some ways. And that's what they were. And Jesus had a lot of dialogue. Some say Jesus was, in fact, from the school of the Pharisees as well, because they were a little bit more moderate, let's say, than the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a rich group of people, of leaders, and the Pharisees had a little bit more relationship because of their connection through the synagogues with the people themselves. But they were still the separated ones. And Jesus has this dialogue, and we have this wonderful story. So we have the who. Now we need to go to what. What is going on here? Well, the Pharisees want to know who Jesus is. And so they have this rabbinic dialogue. And the rabbis do that to this day because this is how Judaism is taught. Very much like Lutheranism. very much like catechetical, right? What in the catechism, those of you that can remember going through that, or if you've never been through it, well, it's in a question and answer format, right? Question and answer. And that's what the Jewish people do very well. To this day, rabbinic, that's how they pass down knowledge. That's how they expand their knowledge. And so it's almost like, when you watch the Olympics, I know you like to watch the Olympics, especially when fencing comes on. And in the Winter Olympics, you'd rather watch curling instead. Now, I lived in Canada, so don't badmouth curling, It's a good. So fencing, right? You know what fencing is? Where you go and you attack the person, and then you go backwards, right? You retreat and you go forward and you go backwards all the time. And this is what the fencing is all about. And that's the kind of dialogue they had back and forth. Who do you say that I am? Tell us plainly. And Jesus says, what? I've told you plainly. You don't listen to me because what? You're not of my flock. This whole John 10 is about the shepherd theme, about Jesus being the good shepherd. And that's kind of important, right? We kind of need a good shepherd in our lives now. Who? Jesus and the Pharisees. What? They are in this verbal dialogue discussing the identity of Jesus, because the identity of Jesus, again, is crucial to anyone's faith. And then we have the question of when. The gospel writer says when. It is at the festival of the dedication. We call that today Hanukkah. Okay? Hanukkah. We'll talk about that because that is the time. So it's winter time. It's in the month that falls in the lunar calendar because the Jewish calendar, very much like the Muslim calendar. By the way, wasn't that ironic this year that Passover and Easter and Ramadan happened all together? Such a thing. So here was this festival of the dedication. Festival of the dedication of what? Right where they were, the temple area. You see, many years before the time of Jesus, almost 200 years, Syria became the overlords of Jerusalem. And so Antiochus III was the ruler, and he was pretty benevolent. He allowed the Jewish people to do what they wanted. But in 167 BC, 167, his son became the ruler, and he was a turkey. Can I say that? Turkey. He was very bad. He was very bad. And he went and he banned the Jewish faith. And it got worse. In 165, he went to the temple and he desecrated it. He put a statue up to Zeus, never a good thing in the temple area, right? Where graven images were never allowed. And then he sacrificed what? Pigs. Because they were what? Non-kosher animals, right? So he defied the temple and he made the people mad. Can you imagine that? Making the people mad because of this? He did. And so they revolted, and Judas Maccabees means the hammer, the hammer. He becomes the ruler of the Jewish people, and they overthrow the Syrians. They kick them out in about 165. But then they needed to do what? They needed to rededicate the temple, which had been defiled. So they went in, they cleaned up, and they got new vestments and vessels all the way around and all those things that needed. But when they got to light the candles, they found out that they only had one flask of oil that was kosher from the high priest. And that was the only thing allowed to be burned in the temple. You couldn't have just regular oil. It had to be blessed by the priest for 8 days. 8 days. And so this is what happened is they poured it in. And what happened? Miraculously, it was supposed to only last 1 day, but it lasted 8 days. And to this day, the Jewish celebrate the day of dedication because of the rededication of the temple. And they celebrate Hanukkah with a menorah, right? How many candles in the menorah? 9. Some have 8, some have 9, because you need one candle to light the others. Yeah, I know, that's kind of but that's what it is. So the menorah certainly is the sign, and was the sign of Judaism for a long time, really until Israel became a country and the Star of David kind of became the preeminent symbol of Judaism. So that's when it took place. It took place during the Feast of Dedication. I don't want to be prophetic. This next week, we have May 14th and May 15th coming up, which means very little to you, but it means a whole lot to the people of Israel. May 14th is the Independence Day, and they have the great day of celebration. And the next day is May 15th. And that's when the Arabs call it the day of catastrophe, because of the formation of the country of Israel. Because the Arabs were already living there before the Jewish people came and took over the land in 1947, 1948. And so you're going to hear things this week. And one of the things is the temple. Now, where is the temple? There is no Jewish temple. Jewish people worship where? In synagogues now, out in local places. But back then, the temple was the main place. And so today we have no temple, but we have the Temple Mount. If any of you have been to Jerusalem, you know in the southeast corner of the old city is this large Temple Mount. You can put 100,000 people up there. To give the idea of the scale, it's a large area. And this is the area where Aqsa Mosque is, and that would have been the area where the old temple was. But when the Muslims came in, there was nothing there, and so they built the buildings that they have up on the Temple Mount. If you want more history there, I can give it to you, but it'll make you cry. It'll hurt you, because that's what my wife says about history, because I like to talk a lot about history, because I think it gives us context for today. It gives us context for what we are reading and hearing. And so I think it's vitally important. Notice also where it took place, Solomon's portico, which was up on top, because there's only 2 temples that were ever Jewish temples there. The first one was Solomon's temple that was built. Why did Solomon build the temple? Because David didn't. Because David what? Had too much blood on his hands. He had conquered too many countries, and so God had told him, you cannot build the temple. And so Solomon built the temple that would last for many, many years up until the time of 587, when it was destroyed and the Jewish people were sent in exile. And 40 years later, they come back and they start a new temple and they build that temple. But it takes a long time to build these buildings. If you've ever been to Europe, you know some of the cathedrals that were over there took hundreds and hundreds of years, generations and generations of people to build. And so that took place also with the temple. Jesus, even when he was alive, the temple was not complete, because they continually remodeled it and in some degrees expanded it so it can handle more and more people. It's interesting that our passage goes further too, that tells us after our gospel lesson today, it says that when Jesus left there, and of course he's getting into trouble, right? They're going to threaten to stone him after these verses, because he's saying what? God and me are one. And that was not according to Judaism at all, that a human being could be, the Son of God, and hence the problem. So here's where you have this issue. Why do some people believe in Jesus and why do some people not? That was the burning question in the early church when John was writing his gospel. Why were some people, why didn't all the Jewish people believe that Jesus was the Messiah? That was a question that was asked then, maybe is asked even to this day. And so John is writing this. John is the 4th gospel, right? It's the last gospel. It's kind of a supplement. It has stories that are not written in the other 3 gospels. So he gives us kind of additional stories that go on. But we notice that in John 10, when he leaves the temple area, where does Jesus go? He goes down to where John was baptizing across the Jordan River. And there many people came and believed. You know, it's interesting with Jesus that he didn't spend much time in the temple area. And when he did, what did he do? He got into trouble because he was questioning how they were doing things, let alone that one little episode. In John, it comes very early where he has already gone in there and done what? Overturned a few tables, let a few birds fly away free, you know, things like that. Didn't endear himself to the sellers and the merchants of the temple trade. But that's what happened. Jesus, when he was across the river, more people came to him than not because they heard his voice. His voice was authentic. His voice was that of the good shepherd. Any of you doing any shepherding in your lifetime? I will defer to you and your sheep. I've spent quite a bit of time in Bethlehem, Jerusalem area. And I can tell you a little bit about shepherding because I've watched shepherds there for many, many days, many, many weeks, many, many months. And it's interesting because the shepherds have their sheep and they have stone fences because everything is built in the Mideast out of stones. Because what do you have everywhere? Rocks. Rocks, 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 rocks. And shepherds like rocks because they use them all the time, right? Who was the great David? And he was the shepherds still to this day will practice slinging or throwing rocks because they go underneath the tree to stay cool. And the sheep will start to nibble themselves into lostness. Have you ever nibbled yourself into lostness? You know, you just go here a little bit further, and a little bit further, and all of a sudden you look up and you're lost. But the shepherd and their men and women, remember Moses' wife was a shepherd. They learned how to throw the rocks out in front to scare the sheep back underneath where they have protection of the flock. That's one of the things that the shepherds do. The other thing that they do is they don't lead. They only lead one time because when you see them around Bethlehem, Jerusalem, the shepherds are in the back. They're picking up the little ones that can't make it. You seen the picture of Jesus with a lamb around the neck? That's what the shepherds do. They come by and take care of the old ones. I'm happy about that now. And the little ones. But they clean up the back. Because the sheep know where to go. They go there all the time through these stone fences that are along the sides of the trails. Except one time. The only time that the shepherd will lead them is when they go to someplace new. Because that's when they need the shepherd and GPS. The good positioning shepherd, right? Right? That's when they need. That's the only time that I've ever seen them is when the shepherd has to change. Because sheep are pretty smart animals. And they will follow each other and go along to the next pasture because they got to change pastures every once in a while because they nibble down all the stuff. And so they have to go from one area to another. And a lot of it's just like in Colorado, it's just with elevation where they can go and find enough water, you know, in the soil where there's enough plant life so that the sheep can thrive. And so that's how they go back and forth. So it's Jesus that today says to us, that he is the good shepherd. And please don't nibble yourselves into lostness because that's never a good thing. He's the good shepherd. When we lived in Hawaii, hence my shirt, these are all homemade Aloha shirts. from members of my congregation when I was there. I'll be wearing different ones throughout the summer. They're all handmade, and so they're all just a little bit off, which I love, because the lady that made these was going blind. And she made me a whole set of these before she had lost her eyesight. But some of the things aren't precise, which makes it lovely, because that's exactly who I am and who you are. We're not perfect. But I used this shirt. When we were over there, we were talking earlier. Everybody says, go to Hawaii. It's an amazing place. And we'd been to Hawaii a number of times. We went there to live. And as soon as we got there, within the first year, we had an earthquake. And it badly destroyed our house. And of course, there's no such thing as earthquake insurance. So everything is out-of-pocket expense. And there's nothing cheap in Hawaii. Let me just tell you this. And if you're rebuilding your house, they have to bring all the supplies from the mainland. And it takes a long time to do it. So we had this terrible experience of this earthquake, and we were there for about 2 years, and we lost so much money on our house, we decided we were going to move, and that was another story. But it also opened up another door. See, when God shuts a door, God oftentimes opens another one. And so we got shut out of Hawaii to some degree, had a wonderful 2 years there outside of an earthquake that badly destroyed our house and scared my daughter literally halfway to death, I think. Because if you've never been into a really big earthquake, there's no such thing. They're earthquakes. They come and they come and they come. What happens is God opens up other doors. So after 3/11 in Japan, we were asked to go to Japan. They said, are you going to come over here? Because you know there's going to be other earthquakes. And we said, we know. We've been there. We take earthquakes very personally. We've experienced the loss that can occur with an earthquake. So no, we will not be run out of Tokyo when the next aftershock comes through. And that's what God does. When we listen to God's voice, when we keep that faith, even in the midst of things that don't go right, even when doors are slammed into our face down the road, we can use many of those experiences, maybe not all of them, but many of those experiences in a positive way. If circumstances in your life, if COVID has kept you away from others in God, if fear or loneliness has caused you to withdraw, if life seems to be one tragedy after another, we have good news today. That Jesus brings us back to the flock and protects us. For the good news that none of us is beyond the shepherd's view or the shepherd's voice, we can truly say this day and every day, thanks be to God. Amen.